Ladies and gentlemen, good morning if you are on the West Coast, good afternoon if you are on the East Coast, good evening if you're in Israel or in Europe. This has become certainly part of our online reality, that when we do these Zoom events, we are as happy as we are to be able to welcome you from wherever you may be, but we have to make sure that we address you accordingly, according to the time zone. My name is Csaba Nikolenyi. I'm the director of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies at Concordia University, and I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted that so many of you have decided to accept our invitation and join us for this exciting, very, very interesting and thought-provoking discussion with Daniel Chertoff, who will be telling us about Palestine Posts, an eyewitness account about the creation of the State of Israel. In a few moments, I'm going to turn the floor over to Daniel, our distinguished guest speaker. But before doing that, let me share a few words about his very interesting and adventurous, if I might say so, biography. Daniel worked prior to joining the academy in the investment industry, both in the United States and in Israel. He used to be an analyst at Sanford Bernstein, where he was a specialist in following the computer industry. Then he made Aliyah, moving to Israel in 1988 with his family, where he continued following the Israeli high-tech industry and helped bring a number of companies, making them public in the United States. Such, Daniel was a successful and distinguished venture capitalist and financial communications counsel to a number of publicly traded Israeli high-tech companies. Daniel took early retirement and he decided to come back to do further studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he specialized in English literature. As he was deeply engaged in writing his doctoral dissertation, he discovered something unexpected, an unexpected treasure, and those were his father's letters. And it's the story that Daniel is about to bring to you today is very much a story that is based on those letters, on those uncovered treasures. Daniel is still, of course, involved in the academy in a number of other ways. Let me just mention one. He is associate editor of Partial Answers, which is an academic journal of literature and history of ideas. Danny and his wife, Arlene, live in Jerusalem today in the German colony. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Danny Chertoff, who is going to tell us the story of Palestine Post. Let me just remind you, if you are a first comer, a first participant in these ventures, in these discussions that we have, that after our speaker finishes the discussion, the presentation, we welcome your questions through the chat room. So please make sure that you send and post your questions in the format of a chat, and that will allow me to manage them very effectively. And depending on how the chat flows, we might have the opportunity also to open up the Q&A to actual questions that you might be able to pose to our speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, let me give you Danny Chertoff.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for participating. I'm delighted to be presenting to the Azrieli Center at Concordia University, and I'm very grateful to the director, Professor Csaba Nikolenyi, and to Jennifer Solomon for making sure everything goes well. Let me start by sharing my screen with you. Okay. In this presentation, I want to share a few select episodes in the most important event in Jewish history in the last 2,000 years, Israel's War of Independence and the reestablishment of the state. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about finding the letters, and this will lead us to a discussion about the relationship of our personal stories to Jewish history. My father, Mordechai Chertoff, was the foreign news editor and war correspondent for the Palestine Post in Jerusalem during Israel's War of Independence. That was from 1947 to 1949, and he remained longer. And he was also a soldier in the Haganah, Israel's army at the time, which was quite illegal. As a kid, I grew up with my father's stories about the war and about life in Palestine, and I was basically tired of them, as all teenagers are with their parents' stories. Still, later I encouraged him to write his memoirs, and I edited them and produced them, and we published them. The memoirs were based on newspaper clippings and on my father's memory, and they were mostly anecdotal. He never told me anything about letters. And as Csaba just told you, when my father died, I found a large cache of letters, mostly those that he wrote from Palestine and Israel to his family back in New York, and their responses. The family had saved everything. At first I thought, well, I'll just scan them in case my children are interested, and we'll see if they ever do anything with them. But I started to read them, and it gradually occurred to me what a treasure I had. First of all, I was very excited by the opportunity to learn more about Israel's War of Independence. I've lived in Israel now for over 32 years. I live with a conflict with the Palestinians, and I was hoping perhaps that learning more about the origins would help me understand the current situation. I was curious, how would his version of events compare to the history books? And what is history these days anyway? How do we deal with personal eyewitness contemporaneous narratives in our ideological and post-historical age? Israeli historian Anita Shapira writes, autobiographical writing is an attempt to give expression to that fleeting moment, to freeze time, to perpetuate what happened in real time before the historians and writers and agents of memory expropriate the past and control its shaping. We currently live at a time when there's no such thing as truth anymore. Narratives, no matter how ludicrous, are all equal. But I had extraordinary material, and I couldn't wait to dive in. But then there are the personal aspects. What would it be like to observe my father as a young man? Novelist Ian McEwan writes, who wouldn't want to travel back in time and encounter their parents before they became their parents? Indeed, what an opportunity. I quickly discovered that my father had proposed to a woman, not my mother. And while he was waiting for her answer, he was, let's say, very close with another woman, and he had his eyes on yet a third. My mother would not enter the picture for another 3 years. I found all 3 of these women were their descendants, and other important people discussed in the letters as well. I'm going to tell you about 2 of them. So basically what I did was I took all of these strands, the letters, many books that I read on the history, the personal aspects, the communal aspects, and I wove them all into a book. Now what I'd like to do tonight is to share excerpts from 4 specific historical events. But first, we need at least a cursory overview of the historical context so that we're all on the same page. So let me just show you a general outline of the war. One of the first questions historians always ask is, how far back should we go? When did the war begin? And most historians will point to this date, the 15th of May, the day after Ben Gurion declared the state, when 5 Arab armies invaded. But I would argue that it started much, much earlier with the Balfour Declaration. As you all know, Lord Balfour in 1917 said, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. So, as you know, in the aftermath of World War I, Britain was awarded a mandate to administer parts of the Palestine district of the Ottoman Empire, and specifically to implement the Balfour Declaration. It's hard to exaggerate how widespread was the support for the creation of a Jewish homeland and the return of Jews to their ancient homeland. The British administered Palestine from 1918 through 1948, during which time there were no fewer than 6 major efforts to solve the Arab-Israeli question. Obviously, none of them succeeded. In the end, historians typically agree with 2 phases. The Civil War phase, which began with the UN vote for partition, the end of November 1947, during which time the local Arab population and local Jewish population fought a civil war. That carried on until Ben Gurion declared the state, and then the conventional war began, and that lasted basically through the summer of 1949. Okay. So my father moved from New York to Palestine in early February 1947 at the age of 25 and quickly got a job at the Palestine Post. A month later, he became its foreign news editor and shortly after was recruited into the Haganah, Israel's secret and illegal army. This is my father, the guy here with the cigarette. And standing behind him is Gershon Agronsky, the founder of the Palestine Post and later mayor of Jerusalem. And this was their elegant staff room. Now, the letters that my father wrote during 47 discuss illegal immigration and various chapters in British Mandate history. In the spring of 47, the UN sent a fact-finding delegation, UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, to analyze the situation and come up with a plan. My father had the opportunity to travel with them and reported on their progress. Their final recommendation was to partition what was left of Palestine after carving out Jordan. And on November 29, 1947, after some modifications, the UN voted to partition Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab countries. This precipitated the Civil War. My father wrote a long description of the night of the UN vote and the following day. He wrote it in Hebrew and apparently in a single sitting. It's filled with biblical and rabbinic allusions. This is part of the original letter. My daughter Rachel translated it. It's very long and it's very rich, but we only have a limited time, so I'm going to share with you just a few excerpts from the letter. The letter begins, Uvechein, Vayhi b'chatzi halayla v'yavo l'tzion goel. And it came to pass at midnight, a Redeemer has come unto Zion. My dear family, Friday afternoon before Shabbat, we sat crowded together and fearful around our huge radio in the newspaper office and heard the proposal to postpone the vote. Our eyes dimmed and our blood froze in our veins. We walked through the silent and sad streets of Jerusalem and found no comfort. We envisioned military posts at every corner and machine guns, explosions and sirens, the terror and suffering renewed. Then comes a clear Shabbat morning under the scalding sun, and the people walk about with some sort of hope and prayer on their lips, and they stream to the Western Wall to pray with the chief rabbis. Friends on the street and in the cafes ask me, the journalist, how the debate will end, what will the night bring? And I answer their prayers with a quiet, "Yeah, beseder, it'll be okay." Dr. Arancha, the secretary of the General Assembly, begins, and the delegates from Lebanon speaks, and another, and yet another after that. And then Gromyko from Russia, hero of the Hebrew state, demands a vote. And suddenly, amid all the chaos, the chairman announces a vote not on delay, but on partition itself. We sat glued to our seats, and each of us with a piece of paper to calculate the prophecy, and pen in hand, and then alluding to the Yom Kippur liturgy, my father writes, and thus he would count 1, 1 and 1, 1 and 2, 1 and 3, until 33, the needed 2/3 vote. A great and joyous cry and silence, the silence of the moment we've waited 2,000 years. In the narrow smoke-filled room, heavy with tension and oppressive concern, one long sigh of relief, the silent Mazal Tov from the depths of our hearts. We left the room, each to his work, and within 15 minutes, the first newspapers went to press. Blessed are we who live at this time and stand on the Holy Land at the time of the great declaration. We embrace, and tears of joy glimmer in each eye. Jerusalem, dead and deserted by 10 o'clock at night, is resurrected. We heard a tremendous roar from Ben Yehuda Street, David Melech Yisrael, Chai v'Kayam, and the roar is repeated again and again from the throats of the youth of Jerusalem, banding together in a huge hora around an armored police car. I left the office with a young woman who had come to hear the news with me, and we raced up the street. We ran and danced and ran and laughed and cried interchangeably without even noticing our tears. We got in a large truck with a great crowd and were like grains of sand. people swarming to the Jewish agency buildings. One young man with a trumpet walked the entire city, and people followed him to the Jewish agency. Suddenly, the blue and white flag appeared on the balcony, and a jubilant fresh hatikva, which we had never dared to hope for and never anticipated, erupted from 5,000 mouths. After that, Golda, 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 Goldie Meir. And she appears and speaks simply and touchingly. One old man, tears streaming down, covering his face and disappearing into his white beard, mutters to a 6 or 7-year-old grandson, "Remember this. Remember, this is what I waited 40 years for. Tears and laughter intertwine." Even now, 24 hours after the birth of the state, I sit writing in my office, waiting to finish the second edition, and it is as if a lump is stuck in my throat, and I fear I'll burst into tears at any moment. Unseemly for a hard-hearted journalist. And we've already paid with our first victims, 7 Jews murdered today. And who knows how great the number will grow until the day of peace will come to us. But there are no doubts whatsoever. Anyone who heard the Ani Ma'amin, the I believe, of the celebrating people, and saw the people striding through the streets of Jerusalem, does not fear what is to come. Truly, Yeh Beseder, everything will be okay. Soon I'll go to bed after 2 days without any sleep at all, but I'm not tired. This great miracle stands before me and robs me of sleep. We must be worthy of it. Good night. With much love and great and blinding joy, Mordechai Shmuel. Now, we Jews have an historical consciousness. We're never satisfied with simply telling a story. We often have to reenact it. Like on Pesach, we have the Pesach Seder. And on Shavuot, we stand in shul and we pretend that we're actually receiving the Torah. And on Sukkot, we imagine what it's like to be living out in the desert. This is how history is inculcated. So to have an eyewitness description of such an important event, it's an amazing thing. There are other descriptions, but I'm very pleased that my father had the opportunity to make his contribution. Now, as I said, the UN vote was like a starting bell for the Civil War. Since it was illegal for Jews to have an army or arms, it was very difficult for Jews to defend themselves. In addition, the Arabs put the Jewish parts of Jerusalem under siege in an effort to starve it into surrender. During the first months of 1948, there were increasing attacks on convoys that were trying to bring food and other supplies from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The city was literally starving. In January of 48, it took 30 trucks a day to supply Jerusalem, and 3 months later, there were none. On January 19th, a convoy going from Kibbutz Ma'aleh HaChamisha in the Jerusalem hills was attacked. 3 Jews were killed and many were wounded. The New York Times mentions the attack, but only in the context of their story on punitive action taken by the Zionists. You can see that media coverage hasn't changed in 72 years. One of my father's dearest friends in Palestine was a young woman from Ohio named Ann Strauss. She was secretary to Dr. Chaim Yaski, who was the head of Hadassah Hospital. And Ann had a boyfriend. Alter Gershon Rechnitz was born in 1914 in Poland and lost his entire family in the Holocaust. He managed to get to Palestine and became a founding member of his kibbutz. He was a farmer, but better known for his strong aesthetic sense. My father wrote about their relationship and also described the attack on the convoy in a tribute to them. I'm going to read to you just a few sentences from his long tribute. Alter's chofesh, his vacation from the kibbutz, was due, and so on Sunday morning they climbed into one of the 3 trucks which made up the convoy, and they found seats for themselves among the crates of fruit and cans of milk the kibbutz was hoping to get to Jerusalem. It was a bright, dry winter's day, a chamsin, or hot spell, which burns all the cold and dampness out of one's bones and erases all memory of rain and mud from Jerusalem's hailstorms. It was a clear day, and the attacking Arabs were in full view as they shot at the convoy from the hills. The driver of the truck they were in was hit and lost control of his vehicle, which skidded into a ditch, breaking the ropes, holding the freight and sending it all into a heap on top of the hidden arms. With the first shots, he pushed her from her precarious seat and stretched out across her body, trying to shield her from the shots. He saved her life and gave his own. He was hit in the head and chest and was dead when Magen David Adom picked him up and put him on a stretcher. She only knew that he had been hit. She felt his hot blood soaking through her clothing as she lay there on the floor of the truck. She was still pleading to see him and asking how badly he was hurt when an injection put her to sleep. She was taken from the aid station to Hadassah Hospital. She'll be told all too soon. A young man died a hero's death, but that's very slight consolation to the girl who loved him. Now, if you've ever driven from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, you may have noticed the old burned out armored cars on the side of the road. They're memorials to exactly these kinds of convoys. Let me bring you up to date. Anne eventually recovered from her wounds, which were not slight, and she married. I finally found her son, Roy, who's about my age, and I was very excited to ask him about more details about the attack. But Roy didn't have any details. He knew it had happened, but his mother refused to discuss it, like many Holocaust survivors. So he knew almost nothing about it, only that it had occurred. Suddenly I show up. I have a detailed account. We read my father's long tribute to it, a long tribute to his mother and to Alter, and the details of the attack, and we cried together. We also shared photographs of our parents. It was an incredible experience. Now, Anne's boss, Dr. Yaski, was murdered a few months later on April 13th in the famous attack on the doctor's convoy. This was a weekly convoy between Hadassah Hospital, located on French Hill, an island in an otherwise Arab area, and the city center of Jerusalem. 81 Jewish medical personnel were massacred. Anne was supposed to have accompanied Dr. Yaski, but he had asked her to stay behind to finish some paperwork. And there's no doubt that this had saved her life. Less than 2 weeks later, it was my father's turn. On February 2nd, the Palestine Post was bombed. My father was in the building when the bomb went off. I want to share with you how the British newsreels shared the event, how they publicized it. This is how news used to get shown long before social media and the internet. It's only 1 minute long, but I think you'll find it interesting.
From Jerusalem come pictures of the latest outrage. This time it's understood to be the result of a bomb placed by Arab terrorists. The offices of the Palestine Post, the Zionist daily published in English, were partly demolished and set on fire. A score of people were injured, and the flames, which spread rapidly, not only made rescue difficult, but also gave the firefighters a very tough job. The fire raged for several hours, and after it had been dealt with, the street soon had all the appearance of an evacuation. Property which had been salvaged littered the pavements, for a block of flats in this Jewish quarter of the old city had also been involved in the conflagration.
Interesting, eh? Anyway, there are a lot of newsreels on YouTube, so if you like that kind of thing, as I do, you can tune into almost any historical event. Now, my father wrote a 4,500-word description of the event, perhaps the most detailed eyewitness description of exactly what happened on that night. It's gripping, but it's much too long to read in its entirety, so I'm going to share just a few selections with you. Dear everybody, one of the boys was walking along Princess Mary Avenue Sunday night when he heard a terrific explosion. He heard somebody shout out in a police armored car he was just passing, "That's the end of the bloody Palestine Post." There was a burst of laughter. The voice was wrong. Somebody dashed over to Haganah headquarters and reported that 100 people had been killed. Miraculously, he too was wrong. I had been sitting in the newsroom at the time. I ran down to the press, and in the dark I saw a figure sitting on the floor. I called in, "Mise, who is it?" And the fellow with whom I work and next to whom I invariably stand at 11 o'clock answered. I ripped down a door to make a path for us. I saw he needed help, but how much I couldn't tell, and rushed in. Having recognized my voice, he kept moaning, "Mordechai, kach oti leMagen David, take me to the aid station." I grabbed him by the shoulders and held on while I yelled for a stretcher. Hugh Orgill of our foreign news staff came by, and together we got Robbie onto the stretcher, and we carried him the 100 yards or so to the clinic and up a flight of stairs to the aid room. Then we ran back, and I draped someone's arm around my shoulders and dragged him to the Magen David as well. During the first few minutes of the rescue work, we were shot out from behind the clinic, and one shot hit an ambulance which burst into flames, but miraculously did not explode. In the clinic itself, all the windows had been shattered and some doors had been ripped off, and with debris all around them, the doctors and nurses went to work like automatons. One of them grabbed me and brought Shimshon, and together we brought Shimshon, another of our makeup men, from the aid station to the operating room. He too recognized my voice and kept telling me he was cold. I explained that he was wet, but I couldn't tell him that it was with his own blood all over him. By the light of the two burning buildings, the street which looked like blitzed London, pieces of wall, balconies, clothing, and a child's doll and shutters were scattered all about. The body of the truck which had brought the explosive was blown across the street in one direction, and its motor sat in a crater alongside the building. As I walked away, I heard an English soldier say, "I guess it'll be a few weeks now before the Post comes out again." I didn't like his tone, so I snapped at him, "Not even days. We'll be out tomorrow if we have to write it out by longhand." And then, with Dov, ran up towards Cafe Atara. Someone had said, "Go over to Lipschitz, a printing shop. They're trying to put out a newspaper." With one linotype machine, we went to work. A dozen correspondents brought typewriters. Everybody pitched in, and half asleep on our feet, we got a paper together. And at 6 in the morning, the Palestine Post appeared. Smaller than usual, but it appeared. And for the morale of the Yeshuv, it was a great thing. People couldn't believe it. It was too much to produce a paper from memory, starting at 1:30 in the morning after the hell that we had been through. It bordered on the miraculous, but we did it. There were people in Jerusalem who did not know that the Post had been destroyed until they read about it in the Post. One of the linotypers died the following morning. The man I carried in, Robbie, is on the border as I write. If he lives, his 3 beautiful little children, whom he used to run with in Rechavia on sunny Shabbat afternoons, will have a blind father. You can appreciate what a tragedy blindness would be to him. Hasolel Street is digging itself out. Stores are back in business while repairs work goes on. One bookshop, He'atid, advertised more open than usual and kept going without even a day off for repairs. Now, 2 days later, my father wrote a follow-up letter with more details. Among them, "Rabbi, my favorite down in the press, will live. I understand that there is even a slight chance for one of his eyes." Well, my father's favorite pressman, Rabbi, eventually succumbed to his wounds about a year later. The youngest of Rabbi's 3 beautiful children is a man named David Nevo. David never knew his father. He was less than 2 years old when his father was in the bomb blast. David is today a very successful high-tech and defense industry executive, but he's a little obsessed with the bombing. He's amassed a lot of memorabilia and he's researched it like crazy, but he knew very little, had very few details. Once again, I, a stranger, show up. I've got an eyewitness account written by someone who loved his father, pulled him out of the wreckage, and probably bought him an extra year of life. So you can imagine how emotional it was for David and I to sit together and to talk about our fathers. 3.5 months later, on May 14th, David Ben-Gurion formally declared the establishment of the state, and the following day, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria attacked, and the conventional war began. But this time, there are no rousing letters describing the declaration. For one thing, there was almost no mail service. For another, no one had time to breathe. Only a year later, my father wrote a description. I'll share just a couple of sentences from it. Jerusalem did not celebrate the declaration of the state. There were no parades and no banquets. All manpower not essential to the city's vital industries had been mobilized. There was little enough food in the city to keep real hunger away, let alone for celebration. After all, Jerusalem had already been at war for 4.5 months. There was no food and no water beyond the pails full doled out by truck under fire. Jerusalem was a desolate city, bristling with roadblocks and dragon's teeth. Jerusalem was a tent city. Every Jew in the city was alerted. Men were lined up and ready to fight. Now, less than a week after the declaration of the state, on May 20th, my father wrote an article describing how the Palmach, that was Israel's elite commando unit, took the Zion Gate entrance to the old city. As a result, the Palmach adopted him and Azaria Rappaport, the war correspondent for Haaretz, and he then invited them to travel with them. My father loved the Palmach, and he reported extensively on their exploits. He wrote to his family, "Let me tell you something about my unit, Haportzim. They're heroes, every last one of them. I would obey an order from their lowest officer. They value each life very highly. The result is that every job is very well planned, carefully executed, and almost invariably successful. You can't begin to imagine how proud I am that they've taken me in and see fit to consider me okay." Last night, Azaria and I were given a note by Yitzhak Rabin, the 27-year-old commander of the Jerusalem sector, saying simply, "Take these 2 men to Tel Aviv, they're okay, and they help us." Now, this note from the future prime minister allowed my father to participate in one of the most dramatic stories of Israel's War of Independence, the creation of the Burma Road, the road which broke the siege of Jerusalem. Earlier, I had told you about the attacks on convoys trying to bring food and arms to Jerusalem, like the one in which Anne was wounded and Alter was killed. As we said, by March of 48, no convoys were able to get through. In addition, the Arabs had cut off the water supply, leaving only what had remained in the cisterns. The governor of Jerusalem, Dov Yosef, did an incredible job in managing the crisis. He organized rationing of food and water and even arranged activities for the residents to keep them occupied. The Jews had made many attempts to open the road and to break the siege, including military operations Nachshon, Harel, Yevusi, and Maccabi. Here's the problem. This is the road to Tel Aviv. This is actually the current road. The road passes underneath the hills of Latrun. At Latrun, there is a fortress called the Castel. This is the scene of many, many bloody battles. Ben-Gurion understood how devastating the fall of Jerusalem would be, and he said, look, if the land of Israel is the heart of the Jewish nation, then Jerusalem is its heart of hearts. There has to be a way to avoid this road. You must find one. So, my father wrote an exciting account of the finding and development of the road. His article opens, "It began with 3 men on foot moving down through the Judean hills in the darkness to the thunder of cannon and crack of rifles at Latrun. The 3 were picked from Palmach's Haportzim unit, the group which had learned every inch of the way during the original road clearing operations Nachshon and Maccabi. My father was at the base camp from which the men set out. Here's the problem. They found this path, which was little more than a shepherd's path, a dirt road. It was okay. Some vehicles could pass, but here, unfortunately, there was a very, very steep grade, and there was no way that trucks could cross it. So, trucks did come in from Jerusalem only till about here, Beit Jiz. They unloaded. Porters carried the material across to trucks that had come in from Tel Aviv, and then the trucks continued on their way all the way up to Jerusalem. Now, 2 nights later, my father and Azariah set out along the same path. In the meantime, the Jews were frantically working to level out the road. Look how steep it is. You can see it's ridiculous. They had to make this much, much wider in order for it to be navigable by trucks. If you've ever seen the movie Exodus or Cast a Giant Shadow about Mickey Marcus, the road and the building of the road is featured. The work included not only making the road wide enough for trucks, but also a pipeline. And by June 10th, the road was usable. There are many, many fascinating twists and turns in the story, but we don't have time to discuss them in detail. I'll just tell you that my father's account ends like this. 3 men went walking on a cloudy summer's night down the hills of Jerusalem, and the siege of Jerusalem was broken. Jerusalem has its lifeline to the coast. Now, next time you come to Israel, the Burma Road is beautifully marked, and it's a lovely tiyul. It's a very gentle tiyul, so I strongly recommend walking along it. You can actually feel what it must have been like then. Okay, by the summer of 1948, my father was in the army full-time. Look how snazzy he looks in his uniform. The pistol is completely unnecessary because he was in the intelligence corps and never went out into the field after that. And he no longer had time to write for the Post. His final assignment was an English language publication for Anglo volunteers for the Army. It was called Frontline, and I think they put out about 6 issues. Okay, that's it. I want to just complete the personal chronology so you know what happens from here. After the war, my father took a position as a press officer in Israel, and he met my English mother, whom he married in London in 1951. My mother was in the British Army during World War II, and after the war went to Marseille to look for any survivors from her family. Unfortunately, she didn't find any. The 2 of them then moved to the US temporarily, which of course became permanent, and my father became a pulpit rabbi in the United States. He then worked for various Zionist organizations until I brought him back to Israel for the last 6 years of his life. I never got a good answer to the question of why he left, but I have my own ideas, and I explore them at length in the last chapter of my book. No matter, my father was totally dedicated to Israel, and at this point, 1 of his children, 3 of his grandchildren and their spouses, all of whom served in the Israeli army, and 8 great-grandchildren all live in Israel. So even if my father didn't live most of his life here, he still left a wonderful Zionist legacy, as well as a lovely account of a very formative period in Israel's history. I want to conclude with just a couple of thoughts about this issue of history and memory. For Jews, the 2 of them are completely intertwined. The philosopher David Hartman writes, "Parents provide their children with luggage. Whether they open this luggage in the future and use its contents is beyond the knowledge and control of parents. My father left me a hell of a suitcase, filled with history, stories, people, and artifacts. I not only opened it, but I've internalized his memories and I've made them mine. Finding the letters, researching the letters and their context, and writing the book has had a huge impact on me, but obviously not just on me, but on Roy Shenkar and David Neveau and many other people that I haven't told you about. But you know something, not even just them, but you as well. Everyone who's on this call cares about Jewish history, and we all have our own amazing history. How every Jew got where they are and their stories are incredibly important. So I would urge you to preserve those history, ask parents and grandparents to tell you their stories. And if you are a grandparent, write down your stories. It's critical that these stories not be lost. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to hand it back to Csaba, and hopefully we'll have a Q&A. I'm going to stop my sharing.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for painting this beautiful, vivid, and very personal account based on the narrative that your father's letters left behind about such an important episode in Jewish and certainly in Israeli history. As we start our Q&A, I would like to remind our friends, members in the audience, that if you are participating in this session today, you are able to benefit from the special 15% discount if you choose to order the book. So please refer to the information that Jennifer is posting on the screen. If you forget or if you don't have the opportunity to note down the exact information, nothing is lost. Send us an email after the event and we would be happy to let you know how you can avail yourself of this discount. Let me just turn to the chat room and see if we have any questions coming in. We have already one from Gladys, and the question is as follows. If the vote was to be carried out today, this is the vote on partition, how do you think it would play out?
Oh, what a question. Jennifer, if you would stop screen sharing, I'd like to go to a wonderful matrix view. Okay, now I get to see more of you. I think that we all have little doubt that if the vote were to be held today, the General Assembly would not vote to create Israel. And it's unlikely that partition would occur. Of course, the General Assembly resolutions are not binding. What's more important is the Security Assembly, the Security Council. So if the Security Council were interested in there being a Jewish state, then maybe we would have one. But I have little doubt how things would turn out today. But I want to reiterate that in the late 40s, and even well before World War II, there was a strong international consensus that there be a Jewish homeland and that the Jews return. It was unclear if the Jewish homeland was intended to be in all of Palestine, which, if you remember, originally included what is today Israel and the West Bank, but also Jordan. So it's hard to know how things would turn out. But fortunately, we have now a very strong state.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I would like to chime in, if I may abuse my privilege as host, by asking you two questions. One, I forgot, maybe you mentioned it at the beginning of the talk, but can you please remind us when your father moved to Palestine? I would specifically be interested in knowing whether he was in Palestine at the time of the very difficult time of the Arab riots, especially between 36, 39. It was a very, very difficult period. If you could just tell us a little bit about his history, his connection with what was Palestine at the time prior to the creation of the state. And if you can link that history with how he experienced the moments and the episodes that you told us about today, that would be great. And my second question is what you think about his intentions might have been about these letters. Did he really not ever want these letters to be found by anyone? Or did he hide them in a way that maybe one day Daniel or somebody, maybe a grandson, a granddaughter, will find them? In other words, is this a story that he never wanted to be told? Is this an eyewitness account that he never really wanted to be told, to be brought to life the way you have? Or quite the contrary? What do you think?
Oh, these are two wonderful questions. Let me start with your first. My father arrived in Palestine in early 1947, and he left in 51, although he had gone back and forth once before that. Having said that, I didn't tell you that in 1935, when my father was 13, his mother took him and his two older siblings to Palestine for the academic year. Think about this. My grandmother in her 40s left her husband back in New York, who had to work, and took 3 children for the academic year in Palestine when under the British mandate. They arrived in the summer of 35, and they left in the summer of 36. So the answer is they were in Palestine at the beginning of the uprising. My grandmother's letters, I have the correspondence between my grandparents during this time period, 40 amazing letters that discuss what life in Palestine was like in 1935 and 1936. And that might be my next book. But my grandmother describes meeting amazing people, becoming friends with Henrietta Zold, celebrating Henrietta Zold's birthday, and dealing with all the political uncertainty at the time. My grandfather arrived in the spring to visit. 2 weeks after he arrived, the riots broke out. I'm sorry, 2 weeks before he arrived, the riots broke out. And my grandfather, having received all these idyllic letters, arrives in Palestine, and suddenly there's chaos and terrible strife. So my father had the opportunity as a teenager to be there during that period, and my father wrote letters then as well. So I have the letters he wrote as a 13-year-old to his father back in New York in 1935 and 1936. So he was there during those two time periods. Now, as to your second question, the letters. This is something that I've thought a lot about. I asked myself, did my father forget about the letters? Did he intentionally not tell me? Did he want me to find them? Did he not want me to find them? I believe in my heart of hearts that my father forgot them. But I like to think that that his decision not to tell me about them was strategic. That rather than reading them together with me and telling me about some of these people, he left it to me to explore them, to seek out these people, to interview them, to learn the history myself. I want to tell you, the woman that he proposed to is still alive, and I found her. I called her and I said, "Hello, I'm trying to reach Hadassah Frisch." She said, "This is Hadassah." I said, "Hadassah, my name is Daniel Chertoff. My father was Mordechai Chertoff." And there's this silence. I'm terrified that she's had a heart attack. And then she says, "Oh my God." And she says, "You know, your father liked me." I said, "Hadassah, my father wanted to marry you." She said, "Well, yes, that's true." Hadassah proceeds to tell me that she's very old and it's hard for her to talk about this. And would I please call her brother who lives in Israel? So I find her brother, Larry, who turns out to be a very famous film director, the director of the movie Casablanca and the Israeli unit director of the movie Exodus. And Larry and I have become good friends. I've also met Hadassah's daughter. And then all of the other people who are named in the book, I found. At one point, there's a woman who my father clearly has an intimate relationship with. I can't find her. And my wife tells me very gently, "Danny, go back into your office and don't come out until you found her." And by scouring census records and immigration records, by 2 nights later, I'm on the phone with her sister-in-law, who died a few months later. And I've become very close with this woman's daughter and was able to send her daughter 12 letters that her mother had written to my father. So if my father had told me about the letters and we had read them and talked about them together, I certainly would never have undergone this research process that took me 3 years and has given me an incredible education. So again, I think he forgot, but I like to think that it was strategic.
Danny, I don't know if you can also see the comments that are coming in the chat, but I do want to mention that it's a beautiful encounter of personal histories and micro histories, really. We have a fascinating post here from Leo. Leo is a dear friend, and he comes to many of our events online, but also when we meet face-to-face in Montreal. And Leo used to be in what was called the Jewish Settlement Police, the only unit that was allowed, the Jewish unit that was allowed to carry guns at that time, that wasn't barred by the restrictions that you mentioned. And Leo was a member of that unit, according to his post, and he's reminiscing that indeed, right after the counting of the vote, 5 minutes right afterwards, the atrocities immediately began and the hostilities started. Thank you, Leo, for sharing that recollection. And we have a very interesting question.
Wait, one second.
Oh, yes, sure. Yes,
I just want to respond to Leo. Thank you so much for that comment. I would love to be in touch with you and hear more about your experience. And you're absolutely right. Immediately after the vote after Ben Gurion declared the state, King Abdullah of Jordan stood symbolically over the Jordan River and fired a shot in the air, symbolically beginning the attack. So that's you're absolutely right about what happened, and I'd love the opportunity to hear more about it. So thank you.
We would be very happy to make, of course, such connections between our guest speaker and any member of the audience. We have a question coming in from Cameron McKenzie, a former student. It's wonderful to see you, Cameron, participate in this event. And Cameron's question is whether before independence, the Jews of Palestine, Jews who lived in the Mandate, were they called Palestinians? Is there any discussion, any reference to what they were called? If I might be broadening perhaps the question this way, how can you answer this question? Or can you answer this question based on your father's treasure trove? Danny.
That's a really important question, and I'm glad to be reminded of this. But in all of my father's letters, he refers to himself and to the other Jews in Palestine as Palestinians. Arabs would have been enraged if you had called them Palestinians. After all, the name Palestine was pejorative, given to the Jews by the Romans when they conquered it. So throughout his letters, at one point he has an exchange with someone where he's asked, do you like hanging out with the Anglos or with the Palestinians? And by that, of course, is meant the Jews. And of course, my father's Hebrew was completely fluent. So he spent most of his time with the Palestinian Jews. So it was confusing for me when I was writing the book to refer to Jewish Palestinians and the Arabs. But in that period, there was no such thing as an Arab Palestinian. They didn't want to hear about that. And it was only with the development of Palestinian nationalism that they began to call themselves Palestinians, and excluded Jews from the name Palestinians. Now, I want to say one other thing. And here I have to defer to Csaba as the expert on history. But I will tell you that I read extensively memoirs of people who were there at the time. Especially interesting to me was the memoirs of Count Folke Bernadotte, who was the UN mediator, as well, and also the John Begat Glubb, who was the British general, head of the Jordanian Legion. Both of them made the same observations, that all of the Arab interlocutors made clear that they would not tolerate the existence of a Jewish state in any space. And at one point, the foreign minister of Egypt tells Count Folke Bernadotte, you have to understand, we couldn't care less about there being another Arab state, about there being a Palestinian state. But it is a matter of life and death to us that there not be a Jewish state. This appears all over. And in fact, Bernadotte, as well as John Begat Glubb, all say there is no justification for another Arab state. Jordan should absorb the West Bank, Syria should absorb the northern part, and there should be a part carved out for the Jews, but there's no such thing as Palestine. So they were very clear. And it's interesting to me that the Arabs took over the name of Palestinians for nationalist purposes and also as a way to change the definition of the conflict from the Arab-Israeli to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It changes the terms of the discussion.
And we have a question from Dr. Blumenthal, Dr. Rachel Blumenthal, who's joining us from Jerusalem as well. And the question is, the letter that you cited at the beginning of your talk, that it was in Hebrew. What about the other letters? Were they in English? And if so, why? And also there is an invitation, if I read it as an invitation to perhaps connect your talk to a very famous novel by Arthur Koestler, Thieves in the Night. Not sure, Dr. Blumenthal is asking whether you read the novel, and if so, how you would connect. That's my reading into the question, how you would connect your story with that of with not so romanticized, but the fictitious rendering of the same similar context of Israeli history in by Koster. So two questions.
Okay, I'm really happy to have this question because it gives me the opportunity to tell you that my father wrote most of his letters in English, except the letters that he wrote to his father were in Hebrew. He and his father corresponded only in Hebrew. My grandfather escaped Russia in 1900, made it to the US. He was an Ilui. He'd gotten Orthodox smicha at the age of 17 and was considered a Talmud genius. And he ended up teaching at the seminary and was a professor of Talmud. But my grandfather adored literature, and he was very literate in secular subjects as well, even did his master's at Columbia University on philosophy. He and my father corresponded only in Hebrew with magnificent handwriting, and neither one could put together 4 lines without a rabbinic or Talmudic allusion. It was really something. So I needed help in translating the letters. So I found a woman who not only had magnificent Hebrew, but could identify for me all of the Talmudic and rabbinic allusions. So my grandfather and father's letters in Hebrew are all heavily footnoted. This comes from Bava Metzia, this comes from Yirmiyahu. So the letters are beautiful. And my father always said, being a lefty, it was clear to him that he was meant to write in Hebrew because it was easier for him to write in Hebrew than it was to write in English from left to right. So most of the letters that I have are in English, but there's quite a large number that are in Hebrew. And then something like the UN vote was so emotional for my father, he couldn't write it in English. He had to write it in Hebrew, to my grandmother's annoyance, because her Hebrew wasn't strong enough to read it. And my father's brother, Gershon, ended up translating the letter, and he circulated his English version in the United States.
Okay, thank you very much, Danny. We have a comment from Philip Greenberg, who's joining us from Montreal. Philip, I think you're referring in your comment to your mom's birth certificate. No, this is a question not from Philip. This is a question from Tamara. Tamara. So Tamara's birth certificate, yeah. So Tamara's birth certificate from 1937 was issued by Medina Palestine in English, Arabic, and Hebrew.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about that in the light of the previous discussion?
During the period of the British Mandate, they were the government, and the language of administration was English, Arabic, and Hebrew. So it made sense. My father, I have all of my father's original documentation. I have his press pass, his identity card, and it too is all in English, Arabic, and Hebrew. And in fact, let me see if I can find my identity card, my Israel identity card. No, it's only in Hebrew and in English. But in those days, it had to be in all 3 languages. So I want to also tell you that my father made Aliyah in 47. He was not a volunteer. So when we brought him back to Israel 6 years before he died, we had the question of, are you a returning Ole or are you a new immigrant? Unfortunately, the Israeli government said, no, he's a new immigrant, but Bituach Leumi, which controls medical insurance, said, no, he's a returning Israeli, and there's a waiting period, and there's a financial fine, and so there were different time periods. And then we took my father's, we found my father's original Tudat Zahut, his original ID card, and it was only a 6-digit ID number. So it was very low, or a 5-digit, I don't remember, but it was not enough digits. So they had to add a bunch of zeros at the end When we went to the office to register him, the pakid, the clerk, was in awe that he had such a low ID number. But in those days, that's what they did. It was all three languages.
Wonderful. I don't see any other questions coming in, and we are a couple of minutes over time. We did say, we advertised that we would be finished around 7 o'clock. Well, it depends on where you are, 1 o'clock Montreal time, 8 o'clock Israeli time. So if there are no last minute questions or coming into the chat or hands coming up in the air, I'm checking the screen, then on behalf of all of us, all over the world, and in Montreal, in Jerusalem, wherever anybody might be at the moment, I would like to say a huge thank you for accepting our invitation, for indulging us with this wonderful first-hand eyewitness account of this momentous and extremely important chapter in the life of the history of modern Israel, in the history of what you call so aptly and appropriately Jewish historical consciousness. I would like to remind members of the audience that the information that Jennifer is showing on the screen is going to help you take advantage of the special promotion on the book if you choose to purchase the book. But you can always follow up with us if you forget to take down the details exactly. Before saying goodbye and asking you to stay in touch with us by email, on social media, so that we could welcome you back to our future events, I would like to also say a very special and warm thank you to Jennifer Solomon, my left hand, my right hand, depending on the day, depending on the time, depending on the mood, for ensuring that this event happened, for ensuring this event happened so seamlessly, smoothly, and that there were no logistical and operational hiccups and problems. Thank you ever so much, Jennifer, for all that you do all the time. Friends, I'm going to say goodbye. We look forward to welcoming you back to our events during the fall semester, which is only a week and a half away. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the summer, whatever is left of it. But most importantly, Shana Tova Umetuka. Be well. And looking forward to seeing all of you soon. Danny, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity. Thank you very much. Stay in touch.